order. Welcome to meeting number 3 of the Standing Committee of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we continue, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the safety and health of all participants, including our wonderful interpreters. You will also notice a QR code on the card, which links to a short awareness video. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best as we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Today we're looking at the topic of recent Russian incursions into Polish and Romanian airspace. And pursuant to Standing Order 1062 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, September the 23rd, 2025, the committee is meeting on the study of Russian incursions into Polish and Romanian airspace. I would now like to welcome our witnesses from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Mr. Eric Laporte, Executive Director, Regional Security and Defense Relations Division, as well as Monsieur Lessard, Stéphane Lessard, Executive Director of Europe Bilateral and European Union Institutions Division, and from the Department of National Defense, Ty Curran, Deputy Director General, International Security Policy. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. I now invite Mr. Larocque to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation to appear today to brief you on recent Russian airspace violations over NATO territory. It's a pleasure to do so alongside my colleagues, Stéphane Lessard, Executive Director, Northern and Central Europe Relations Division at Global Affairs Canada, as well as Mr. Ty Curran, Deputy Director General for International Security Policy at the Department of National Defense. Mr. Curran and I had the honor of briefing your colleagues at the Standing Committee of National Defense last week, and we look forward to your questions. Before starting, however, I would like to provide a few remarks that provide some context to the recent events and speak to Canada's contributions to Euro-Atlantic security and support to Ukraine. Since September 10th, we have seen an increase in airspace violations over NATO allied territory on the part of Russia. This has included multiple drones overflying Poland and Romania, as well as an airspace incursion by 3 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets over Estonia. We have also seen unauthorized incursions over airspace of Copenhagen and Oslo airports by drones. While it wasn't immediately clear who was behind the flyover of Denmark's Copenhagen airport, Prime Minister said that Russian involvement could not be ruled out. There were some further disruptions in Denmark overnight. There has been no attribution yet, except for the Danish Defense Minister saying that it was a professional actor. Airspace violations on the part of Russia are not a new phenomenon. This has been a regular occurrence since Russia began its illegal invasion of Ukraine, but has accelerated in intensity and scope in 2025, including with the use of drones and fighter jets. In response to most recent incursions, NATO and the affected allies showed determination, resolve, and demonstrated unparalleled allied interoperability. The recent interception of Russian drones over Poland by allied aircraft, for example, included a coordinated response involving Dutch and Polish fighter jets, a NATO early warning aircraft, an Italian air-to-air refueler, and German ground-based interceptors. Similar allied coordination happens in most instances. Both Poland and Estonia invoked Article 4 of the Washington Treaty following the incidents. For the benefit of the committee, I would like to specify that Article 4 of the Washington Treaty states that allies would consult each other whenever, in the opinion of one of them or more, the territory, political independence, or security of any of them is threatened. This is intended as a strong political signal to adversaries that a particular ally or allies feel threatened and may request assistance from other allies. This is not the same as Article 5, the collective defense clause of the treaty, where an attack on one ally is considered an attack against all. Following the September 23 Article 4 consultations this week, the North Atlantic Council issued a statement condemning Russia's reckless actions, which are escalatory, risk miscalculation, and endanger lives. A North Atlantic Council statement means that it was agreed by all 32 allies to send such a message. In the statement, allies reaffirmed their unshakable shared commitment to defending Allied territory. They confirmed that General Gridwich, NATO Supreme Allied Commander, has the tools and authorities he needs to ensure NATO's defense. Eastern Sentry, which was launched following the incursion into Polish airspace, adds further strength and flexibility to NATO's posture along the eastern flank. Deliberate or not, Russia's recent reckless actions are part of a dangerous pattern of cyber hybrid activities by Russia to test and probe Allied responses. I can just show examples of sabotage, disturbances to GPS, weaponization of migrants, sabotage of critical underwater infrastructure, and disinformation campaigns across Europe as examples. With all of this going on, you might ask, how is Canada protecting its allies? NATO remains a cornerstone of Canada's defense. We are contributing substantially to the alliance's core tasks and missions, including along the eastern flank. Canada's troop contributions to NATO's multilateral brigade in Latvia, which we lead, has more than doubled in size since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and is growing stronger. This is a tangible demonstration of Canada's commitment to the Baltic security, one of which Prime Minister Carney renewed for another 3 years just recently. Canada is also the third largest contributor to NATO's mission providing security assistance and training to Ukraine, also known as NSATU. Sous notre présidence du G7 et en consultation avec nos partenaires, le Canada continue de faire pression.
Under our G7 presidency, in consultation with our partners, Canada continues to press Russia to end its war in Ukraine. Last summer, at the G Summit at Kananaskis, Prime Minister Carney announced the largest package of trade and maritime sanctions imposed by Canada since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In Charlevoix, in March 2025, the G7 foreign ministers also adopted the G7 Statement on Maritime Security and Prosperity, a Canadian initiative that reaffirms the G7's strong commitment to contributing a free, open, and secure maritime domain based on the rule of law that enhances international security, promotes economic prosperity, and ensures environmental sustainability. In this initiative, Canada has established a Phantom Fleet Task Force with participating G7 members in partnership with the 8 Nordic and Baltic countries. Canada continues to work with its close partners to coordinate additional measures against the Russian regime in order to increase the economic cost of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Most recently, on September 22, 2025, Minister Anand met with her G7 counterparts on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly. In a joint G7 statement this week, the ministers expressed their concern over recent violations of Russian airspace in Estonia, Poland, and Romania. These are unacceptable violations which threaten international security. They reaffirmed their determination to work together to achieve a lasting peace and a strong, independent, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine by continuing to coordinate their efforts with the United States to provide Ukraine with strong and credible security guarantees. The ministers also discussed the need to impose further economic sanctions against Russia, including measures against third countries that facilitate its activities. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, I can say that NATO's response to Russia's actions remains firm. NATO has undertaken vigorous steps to strengthen our deterrence and defense posture in the face of Russia's persistent attempts to test the alliance's defenses. Canada remains committed to contributing to the security of our allies, particularly on NATO's eastern flank, and to support Ukraine, whose security contributes to ours, in its right to defend itself against continued Russian aggression. We will continue to work with our allies to rebuild Ukraine and strengthen its long-term resilience. That being said, Mr. Chair, we'd be delighted to answer any questions you may have.
Questions will begin with Mr. Chong. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to clarify with our witnesses exactly what incursions have happened over the last month. So, as I understand it, there were drones, Russian drones, that went into Polish and Romanian airspace. You also enumerated that Russian jets went into Estonian airspace, and that it appears that there were Russian drones over Copenhagen and Oslo airports. Have there not also been incursions into Lithuanian and Latvian airspace as well?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I can start, and my colleague, Mr. Kern, might have some additional details to provide. We have seen over the course of the year an increase in Russian airspace violations, and that has increased since 2022, but certainly markedly in 2025. Since September 10th, we are tracking Polish incursions, Romanian incursions, Estonia incursions with fighter jets, Denmark we have seen, and Norway also with drones. Again, those have not been specifically attributed to Russian activities, though the authorities in Denmark have noted that those were conducted by a very capable actor. I'm not aware of Lithuanian or other drones, but it is quite possible.
Yeah, I'm just referring. It was referred to by Secretary General Mark Rutte in his press conference of the 12th of September 2025, where he noted that there were airspace violations that occurred also in Latvia and Lithuania. That's why I asked. Yeah. Oh, okay. So, what air assets do we have in Eastern Europe? I think we have some CF-18s. Is that correct? And some Griffin helicopters as well. What exactly do we have in terms of air assets?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So in Latvia, we currently have 4 helicopters, Griffin helicopters, that are deployed there. We previously had Chinook helicopters as well. We have transport planes that are in Prestwick in the UK, but we do not have fighter assets that are in Europe, other than on a deployed fashion, other than periodically for exercises. So those are the permanently or the deployed assets right now.
NATO announced Operation Eastern Sentry, which is predominantly an air operation. Is Canada involved with Operation Eastern Sentry, and if so, how exactly? With what assets?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So we're absolutely working with our NATO allies on Eastern Sentry. We have not provided forces to date, although we are looking at what could be provided. I would just add our contribution to NATO includes also the work that we do in terms of deterrence with Latvia, as well as the work that we do here at home with NORAD.
Yeah. I note that the Russian fighter jet or Russian drone and jets that have violated NATO airspace in some cases flew many kilometers into NATO airspace and for durations of nearly an hour. Like, at one point, do we shoot these things down?
Maybe I can start. We saw on September 10th that NATO did shoot down a number of Russian drones at that time. Again, as I mentioned earlier, airspace encroachments by Russian fighter jets or drone is not a new phenomenon. I think every time they cross, there's a decision that needs to be taken in real time by commanders on the ground and authorities. And there's also issues of wanting to ensure the safety of personnel on the ground. If you shoot something down, where is it going to land? Does it pose a threat to civilian population, et cetera?
Is our stance with respect to these incursions, is NATO's stance with respect to these incursions, has it changed since the initial wave? Like, is the action going to be, is kinetic action going to be a lot quicker in the future than what we saw in the last month?
Thank you for the question, Chair. We saw on September 12th, in response to the Polish air incursion, this setting up of Eastern Sentry, as my colleague mentioned. That's a new activity for NATO. It is looking to gather some additional capabilities and forces, including fighter aircraft, early warning systems, jamming capabilities, and it's going to be mixing traditional and novel traditional capabilities as well as novel technologies. So this is ramping up. There's also there's a cost factor or a cost curve involved to shoot down drones, for example. Some of these are not very expensive to produce, and Russia can mass produce these using high-end fighter aircraft and high-end missiles to shoot those down at the cost of hundreds of thousands.
I have one last question before my time is up. So Russia started these incursions a month ago and then followed up with a number of subsequent incursions. It seems to me that our deterrence is not sufficient. Is there discussions going on about increasing deterrence?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Again, I would want to point out that, Russian drone incursions is not a new phenomenon. They've been doing it since 2022, essentially, but the pace and scope has increased recently. Since that has happened, NATO has invoked twice 2 Article 4 consultations amongst allies as a message, has launched Eastern Sentry, and so I would assume that there will be a greater response in the future.
Thank you. Madame Fautier,
Merci,
vous
monsieur.
avez 6 minutes.
6 minutes. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci d'être...
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here today in order to be able to share share with the committee the study we're doing. You can imagine Canadians being quite nervous, myself included, about what's going on currently. We know that with the invasion of Ukraine, pressure is building up in a certain area, and I find that very worrisome. So I think today we need to have an update as to what Canada is doing. How are we proceeding with our allies? How are we advancing some diplomatic strategies? Could you share more of the diplomatic measures that are being undertaken to reinforce the collective defensive posture of NATO facing these recent incursions? Thank you, Chair. In terms of diplomatic initiative, I mentioned a few already. As the president of the G7, Minister Anand convened her peers in New York, to discuss the Ukraine situation and the Russian incursions. The 7 members of the G7, including Japan, wrote a joint declaration condemning Russian action. After the events in Poland in September, GAC convened the Russian ambassador to Ottawa in order to also condemn these actions and to emphasize the fact that Canada is observing what's happening very closely, and that if it continues, there'll be a risk of repercussions from Canada and from NATO. And as we always do, we always look at the possibility of imposing further sanctions. So that's on the diplomatic side. I don't know if Mr. Curran wants to add anything. Thank you, Chair. Maybe just to add, the reason why we invested in the Canadian forces is that we want to increase our capacity in terms of fighting drones and defending the airspace, that we might have better capacity to respond in such situations, and also to increase our deterrence. So be it with Poland and Romania, and then we saw it with Lithuania and Estonia. Were there things that were done on a bilateral level? Did the government undertake more specific actions with those countries? Thank you, Chair. In all instances, we had conversations with our allies, either NATO or either in a bilateral way. The minister committed to discussing with some of his peers of countries that were affected. And as was already mentioned, we're in Eastern Europe, and we're helping the efforts there on the land forces as well. My colleague maybe has something to add. Just to confirm that Minister Anand had discussions with her peers. I'm thinking about the Vice Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Ministers, Mr. Sikorski in Poland. And today in New York, there were discussions, yesterday and today, in order to communicate these messages of solidarity and firmness in terms of the Canadian commitment to Poland's security, as well as all countries on the eastern flanks. In what degree do you think that the response of NATO was effective? How do you measure the effectiveness of the actions that are taken? And is there something else that we would need to start doing or to add faced by this pressure? Of course, it's something to watch closely. The reactions of NATO are happening now. Eastern Sentry will take a while before reaching its full force and greater capacities, and we'll see what the Russian reactions will be. So since 2022, even since 2014, Russians have been doing what we call probing to see what the Allied reactions will be. We saw in the Baltic Sea there were often instances of critical infrastructure sabotage. NATO in 2023 initiated the program Baltic Sentry to have more monitoring, and since then we've seen a decrease in that type of action. So the reaction's not always immediate, but we hope that this is sending a strong message to the Russians. Does anyone else want to add something? So I'm good, thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Fortier.
Lemire. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Merci pour l'accueil au comité.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you and welcome to the committee. So we see the city of Poland and Romania, and also there was a situation in Denmark where we saw drones that were seen at least at night, and this was carried out by an unknown professional actor. And it's not. This does not exclude the fact that it might be Russia. The Prime Minister said that it was the most serious attack against critical infrastructure in the country. She also mentioned that this is part of the evolution that we've been observing lately with other drone attacks, violations of airspace, and cyber attacks against European airports. So Denmark was strategic. It's one of the founding members of NATO, and it's a door to Eastern Europe through the north way. So do you think we can make a connection with what we're talking about today? Do you think Denmark is being targeted, or is it NATO that's being targeted? Well, I don't want to put myself in the place of the Danish authorities who are responding to the situation, actually. So they didn't say that they were Russian drones, but they said it was a capable actor who did that. So who are the capable actors? There are not many in that field, so that is a possibility. But I don't want to go any further than what the Danish authorities have said. Was it targeting Denmark or other targets? So there are several instances of drones just about everywhere. So it's quite possible that it wasn't simply targeting Denmark. Laval University researchers are saying that Russia is trying to find out more about the true capacities of the alliance. So with these missions, Putin is gathering military intelligence on the type of reactions carried out by NATO, on the capacities deployed, the response rapidity. So do you think that they're testing this as a point of entry for the future? As mentioned, it's not the first time that the Russians are sending either drones or planes in NATO airspace. And we've seen that since 2014-2022. There's always this attempt to see what NATO's reactions will be. Every time, NATO has reacted and adapts its response measures. I don't know if we have anything else to add. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game. Russia and NATO and both sides are always adapting and responding to each other, knowing that on the NATO side, it's an alliance that's defensive in nature, and it's the Russians that continue to initiate, to make these incursions into Allied territory. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, warned against the true risk of an extension of the Ukrainian conflict beyond its borders in relation to what's going on. Do you also have that same concern that it might broaden from country to country and that it might even reach as far as our country? Yes, the risk of escalation exists, and the NATO communique emphasized that this kind of behavior risks being escalatory, and that NATO is ready to respond if it's necessary. If we need to have an Article 5 response, we are, via the Washington Treaty, involved in that response. Did you evaluate the risks of incursion that might have been made on Canadian territory recently? Have we seen any incursions in the past few days? I'm not aware of any, but I can pass the floor to my colleague, Mr. Curran. Thank you for the question. The simplest answer is no. We have not seen any incursions here in Canada. Over the past year, there has been no penetration of our air defense identification zone. Which is not a part of our legal territory, but it's part of our defense system here in Canada, along with NORAD and the U.S. Thank you. With what has just happened in at least 3 allied countries, have you increased the level of vigilance and surveillance over our airspace? NORAD is always observing threats here in Canada and in the U.S. I don't know about the warning level that has been determined at this point, but they always are watching out for air and sea incursions. So there's been no increase of this since then. Answer, I don't have any of that information, or I don't have any such information. Thank you.
And I turn to MP Cramp-Newman. You have 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you, Chair. A question for any one of you. Is there any thought that this may be Russian penetration testing on Baltic states for a potential breakout of the Baltic fleet out of the Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg, especially in the wake of Finland and Sweden entering NATO recently? Effectively blocking the fleet to get in?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. It is highly likely that this is probing by Russia, as we know they do and they have done, and they will continue to do. Whether this is going as far as for a breakout of the Russian fleet, I haven't seen anything to that effect. I don't know.
Thank you. What assets, are you aware of what assets that NATO has deployed to contain the Russian Baltic fleet?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I don't have the full detail of NATO's disposition. What I could perhaps say is Following the 2014 invasion and the full-scale invasion in 22, NATO has significantly augmented the forces that are on its eastern flank, both from a land, air, and naval point of view, and Canada has contributed to all three.
From a NATO doctrine, where is the threshold between that of incursion and an act of aggression?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I mean, incursion into airspace, again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, these has happened a number of times since 2014. Recently, you know, the quality and length and duration and number of drones coming in has increased significantly. That said, there's a difference between a drone overflying airspace, going from point A to point B through NATO airspace onto Ukraine, for example, or loitering. These are not conducting attacks per se. They're most of the time can either be decoy drone, reconnaissance drones, and then there's a cost issue, there's a cost benefit or an escalatory calculation that is made by commanders on the ground or in the air, whether to shoot it down or not, in terms of where it is over civilian infrastructure. You know, the cost of you know, the missile that you need to shoot this thing down, or just letting it go.
Could you speak to the current status of Canada's anti-drone capacities, and are there any current procurement projects happening?
I cannot. I think
Thank you for
that
the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, we have made investments to provide both counter-air and counter-drone, particularly for our forces deployed in Latvia. These are also areas that will be part of the investment made under the increases for defense spending.
Okay. Is there any indication that the nations that have had their airspace violated were targeted because of their recent rearmament campaigns?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. To my knowledge, all of the countries that are there have increased their defense spending significantly, but I also think almost all NATO allies have done that, so I don't believe it would be there, but that is ultimately a hypothetical question I don't know the answer to.
And just to follow up to a question earlier, what assets does the CAF currently have deployed in the three nations that have been targeted by Russia?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the majority of our forces are deployed in Latvia, which is where we have our battle group. As I've mentioned, we do have as well maritime assets that are deployed to Europe right now.
And do they have the capacity in Latvia to respond to the drones?
Yes, yes, they do, although we continue to make investments in that regard.
Okay, perfect. Has there been any requests from the nations whose airspace has been violated to support? Has there been the ask? I'll start again. Has there been any requests from the nations whose airspace has recently been violated for support from Canada or any of the NATO allies?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. As mentioned earlier, there was 2 Article 4 consultations in the context of NATO. There was a decision to stand up Eastern Sentry, which is a request for all allies to provide capabilities as they can. So through NATO, there has been requests for Canadian assistance. Those are being looked at and examined. But again, our contribution at the moment in terms of the eastern flank is very much focused on the Latvia component.
Perfect. And my last question is, how is the Canadian government balancing deterrence without escalation?
Thank you for the question. That is basically a daily task that us and our allies are doing in terms of ensuring safety and security of allied populations, but also supporting Ukraine in its fight for Russia and so against Russia. And so again, that is a daily.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We now turn to Mr. MP Oliphant.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. And thank you for the work you do every day, both in diplomacy and intelligence and in our defense security. Two areas of questioning I'd like to come into. The first area has to do with risk assessment. And obviously, we have zero tolerance for an incursion of any kind into a NATO member. That is something that we have been very clear about. But in terms of risk assessment, when you're looking at the other activities that Russia is doing with respect to violation of our sovereignty, territorial integrity in other ways, looking at sabotage, looking at cyber interference, looking at intelligence gathering, foreign interference in our countries. How do we rate this one? I'm not minimizing it, but how do we rate it compared to cutting cables under the Baltic, or how do we, destabilizing energy and all the gray zone areas? These are, a lot of them could be dummy drones and cause a huge distraction for us while maybe more nefarious activity is taking place. Where should this committee be drawing its attention?
Great question, Mr. President. It is a great one because, as we've seen, Russia is active in many, many domains, and this sort of drones or overflights is something that has been happening for a while, but is getting a lot of attention at the moment. As the countries that have been affected by the violation of airspace, of course, they feel very strongly that this is a violation of their sovereignty, their territorial integrity, etc. But at the end of the day, it's a drone flying through their airspace and leaving most of the time unscathed, no damage, whereas we know that Russia is very active in the cyber front, has done a number of sabotage activities that has resulted in loss of property, etc. So again, your question in the scale of things is a great one.
And I don't expect an answer on it, but I'm raising it because I think the committee needs to consider it. I was in Moldova in the summer, and in Moldova, watching the level of interference from Russia in the sovereignty of Moldova in terms of its upcoming elections, in terms of the way they were using money to buy support. That seems to me to be horrendous activity in a near neighbor to our NATO neighbors. And I'm just wondering, I may just put that on the record that I'm looking for a threat assessment at some point. Maybe we need to consider it as a committee. The second area of questioning has to do with our response. I understand that the minister directed officials to call in the Russian ambassador and to express our concern. Following up on Madame Fortier's questions, there's a range of activities, from diplomatic, from demarches, from, we have 5,000 sanctions on Russia already, or I forget the new number. We have a range of activities in terms of what we can do. Should our quiver be growing? Are there things that we should be doing more to express very strongly to Russia our, not only displeasure, our outrage at their engagement with our NATO partners?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. You outlined rightly some of the steps we've taken following the September 10th incursion and highlighted our very robust sanctions regime at the moment. As I mentioned in my remarks or in response to some of the questions, those are always constantly being reviewed, and there is lots of work going on now amongst G7 partners and amongst other allies for additional measures, including looking at what more can be done in the oil and gas, for example, which continues to fuel Russia's war.
And maybe the last question. Have we demarched non-NATO members to ask them to express concern to Russia with respect to the territorial integrity of a NATO, or it doesn't, for me, Russia's activity into NATO under Article 4 with consultations and Article 5 are critical because that's our allyship. But have we gone to other non-NATO members to express that we would like them to talk to Russia to say, back off?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. We have not demarched in the real sense countries on this, but we have in a lot of our interactions with NATO and non-NATO allies signaled obviously our concern and the recklessness of the Russian behavior.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. We now go next to Monsieur Lemire. Vous avez 2 minutes et demi.
Merci.
You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Some researchers have raised the fact that Russia, through its actions, is wanting to expand the war in Ukraine so that this conflict doesn't stagnate. Do you have an opinion on this statement that Russia is trying to destabilize the Russian conflict? good question. I don't have any information about it, but if we look at what we've been observing, what Russia's been doing since 2014 and since 2022, Russia's always trying to have an advantage in relation to the other countries in the region. There's still a very Soviet kind of mentality to have the eastern countries that joined NATO come back under the umbrella of Moscow. Thank you. Poland lately increased its military capacity, so Russia wants to know what kind of equipment Poland has. Where are the ammunition and weapons factories located? So it's thought that Russia has gone into that zone to get this information. To what degree do you think Russia's been able to gather information or intelligence from the area that was flown over? And what impact would that have on its strategy? Thank you for the question. I don't know what's happening there, but it's certain that Russia is taking advantage of its incursion to gather intelligence, and that's one of the reasons why we have concerns when we have such events, and that's why we need to to strengthen our capacities to have more possibilities to respond if need be. What mechanisms should be put in place to block these attempts, which might be akin to espionage? And are these mechanisms used, or do they apply to Canada as well? Thank you for the question. I think there are always lessons that we can gather in such situations. As I've already said, it is an advantage for our investments in the Defense Department, especially in our air capacities and especially in drones.
Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for appearing before committee today. Is not precedented or unprecedented, actually, what we've seen of what Russia is doing, the multiple attempts against multiple NATO members. And it's funny that it goes from the Baltic all the way to inside interior Europe, to Romania and to Poland. It seems like a type of a tactic of bullying in one aspect of it. Obviously is not unplanned, is well planned, is maybe trying to, it's one of those campaigns trying to confuse us and to keep us busy wandering around the 30-plus members of NATO. What do we do with Russia and with Putin, with his power? You know, unfortunately, such an empire that survives on wars, on conflict, and it's becoming our problem in the Western world, in NATO, and obviously across the board. Such attempt could really trigger Article 5. If they went too stupid to try to hit a target at any of the countries, that we will be facing Article 5. Now, from your knowledge, and I'm going to ask you as an expert on NATO constitution and what constitute NATO's members to act upon such threats, what could trigger Article 5 in this case? And we know Article 4 doesn't apply because the members that have been attacked or been subject to, they will be having to consult with the rest of the members' allies. So what could trigger Article 5? It shouldn't be Article 5, at least be an option in front of Russia. And unfortunately, such thing could also trigger a third world war of some kind. So this is a very tricky situation. I would like to see in the term of NATO, how do you see this is going to play between Article 4 and Article 5?
For the question, Mr. President, a very good question. It's worth remembering that in all of its history, NATO only invoked Article 5 once in its history, and that was following the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Article 4 has been invoked nine times so far, 5 times by Turkey following events around its borders, a number of times by European allies following the invasion in 2022, and then, of course, we have Poland and Estonia this week. You asked the question, Mr. Chair, on, what are the triggers? The beauty of Article 5 is it's pretty clear. In one way, in the treaty, is that it's an attack on an armed attack against an ally. At the same time, it's also a little bit fuzzy in that it's an armed attack against an ally, and that's not defined. There are advantages of having it that way to ensure that our adversaries are, don't know exactly where the threshold is.
Do you believe that, there's between Article 4 and Article 5, there's a huge space right there. Do you believe that what we know, what we don't know, we don't know, but what we know, do you believe that the NATO response was sufficient enough to deter? And what could also be done to make sure we escalate without a huge escalation, without going into war?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Do I know if it's sufficient to deter? I don't. It's speculative. That said, the messaging that the alliance has put out is fairly clear, is that collective defense is strong and we stand and are committed by it. And so Russia should be taking heed of that.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add.
I would love for you to weigh on it. For sure.
Obviously, it's hard for us to speculate on Russian intentions in this space. What I would say is, regardless of those intentions, we've seen a reinforcement of the eastern flank with Eastern Sentry. Similarly, as we saw after the invasion in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 22, with a reinforcement of NATO forces, including Canada, on the eastern flank. We've also seen Sweden and Finland join the alliance, making the alliance stronger. And so I think, our continued as these activities happen, I think we also adapt as well, as my colleague said, the sort of cat and mouse game. But I do think that NATO is stronger today than it was in 22, and I expect it provides a very strong deterrent effect as part of that thinking, which of course is still speculative.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abultaif. We now turn to MP Anita Vandelbel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here to answer these questions on these vitally important topics. I'm hoping that you can put this a little bit into context, because we're hearing things and the public is hearing things that sound very alarming. You have said that while it's not new, there's been an escalation, there's been more incidents. But if you look at this in the context going back to, say, the Cold War, are there other periods where you've seen this kind of escalation and then you've seen maybe a pulling back, or is this unprecedented? Is this something that is completely new we've never seen before?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I would say the fact that you have Russia in an active and open war on European territory in the context of NATO being in existence, that is unprecedented. Russia probing Allied defenses and responses, I would say that is not unprecedented. We saw that throughout the Cold War, also not only in Europe, but also vis-a-vis North America, where the issue of having to scramble jets to escort Russian out of NATO or North American airspace was a reality. So that's I don't think it's unprecedented in that context, but I don't know if Mr. Kern has other.
Yeah, if I could just add, Mr. Chair. So penetrations by Russian military aircraft into North American air defense identification zones has certainly increased over the last couple of years, but it's also relatively regular. We expect that this is a bit of a return to pre-COVID levels. And so while we've observed this increase in activity, I would just note that these flights occur regularly and are not deemed threatening, as Russian military aircraft remain in international airspace and do not enter Canadian or American sovereign airspace. And I would say for the vast majority of these engagements have been professional, which is distinct from what, or is different, I guess, from what we're seeing on the eastern flank.
Okay, thank you. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by professional?
In the sense that behavior is standard. I'm certainly not a pilot, so I won't pretend in that space. But just to say that when we talk about safe and professional, it's the behavior of the aircraft in a way that is predictable, that is standard, and that recognizes sort of international best practices, as opposed to, for example, someone who's behaving in an erratic manner that could be dangerous to both parties.
Okay. Are there certain incursions that you are more worried about than others? I mean, obviously, a fighter jet is very different than a drone, and where they are doing this might differ. Frequencies. Is there some element in this that is raising more red flags than what you normally would?
Mr. President, I could start, and then I'll invite Mr. Curran to join in. I think what becomes more worrisome or of concern is kind of duration and depth, and location. If they're sort of penetrating deeper into airspace, or loitering a lot of time, or going over critical infrastructure, civilian airspace, etc.
Perhaps I would just add, Mr. Chair, the question of are they armed is certainly significant. While we are concerned about intelligence gathering, we are concerned about activities regardless of that. When we know that the aircraft or drones are armed, it increases the risk significantly of an unplanned escalation, to your colleague's comments earlier.
And have they been armed?
Certainly the MiG-31s that flew down that space were armed.
And then, if you could perhaps, you mentioned that we have called the ambassador. What is Russia's response to this? Is Russia taking responsibility? Are they trying to hide the fact that this is happening? What is their response?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I would say standard Russian practice is denial. In the case of the conversation we had with the Russian ambassador here, there was a whole bunch of other theories. They were jammed, electronic warfare, not ours. And as Russia tends to do, sort of put out a smokescreen of other possibilities. They haven't denied that the MiG-31s flew in the direction that they did, but they certainly say that it wasn't into anybody's airspace. So again, it's a usual pattern of Russian denial.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll now go to MP Rood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for being here with this and providing this information. From Canada's briefings at the North Atlantic Council and Allied Air Command, what are the top 3 capability gaps that are exposed by these incursions?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I don't know that I have a definitive list, but I would say I think we've recognized the importance of investments in counter-drone capability. I think there is absolutely a need for increased air defense capability. Listing a top 3, those 2 certainly would jump out to me right away. I think we've seen the significant increase of drone warfare as part of the war in Ukraine, which underlines the need for investments across the alliance in those capabilities.
Thank you. What additional Canadian contributions have allies requested from us?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Perhaps just my understanding of the list of requirements is that it's a classified list, and so perhaps I could return to you just if there is an unclassified ability to provide that information.
Thank you. That'd be appreciated. Did Allied ISR produce indications and warnings of these overflights early enough to cue shooters, and if not, what latency points delay?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Given the tight geographic space between Russia and our eastern allies, while we have the ability to track, NATO, have the ability to track these drones or planes, The timing of them doesn't always leave the ability to have forces in the air all the time, especially given the activity that's going on in Ukraine. So we have the ability to watch that and to respond if we deem it to be a threat. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Precisely what Canadian assets have been committed or offered to reinforce NATO's eastern flank after these incursions, and with what deployment timelines?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. At this point, we have not provided additional forces, although, as mentioned earlier, we are significant contributories to deterrence on the eastern flank as part of our contribution to Latvia.
What near-term remedial actions, such as deployment, sensors, or software, are being executed in the next 90 days?
Fortunately, Mr. Chair, I don't believe I have the answer to that question.
Okay. If you do find some information, if you could return that back to the committee, that would be, it might be classified as well, but if it's not classified, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to.
Thank you. What additional authorities or resources are being requested from the department to enact the government's response?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. At this point, we have not made additional requests to the government there. It's part of our discussion with NATO about what sort of capabilities Canada is able to provide, recognizing that we continue to provide support in Latvia to deterrence as well as to air defense support here through NORAD.
Thank you. Am I close to time, Chair?
No, you still have 1 minute and 20 seconds.
1 minute. I'll cede my time for right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will next go to MP Blair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and welcome and our thanks to all of you for presenting yourselves here today. I note, actually, Ty, you said that you didn't want to speculate on what the Russian motivation is, but I think we could speculate a little bit, that they were both testing our capabilities and also testing our resolve. And given the reaction, in particular of President Trump, President Zelensky, the EU leadership, and what we've heard from President Tusk and others, most recently in response to this, I would like your assessment, all of you, on what impact this probing by Russia has had on NATO resolve. Because we've talked about investment, but it's a matter of declaration of resolve, but it's also what that can mean for the next steps.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Chair, maybe I can start. I think the question of NATO resolve is pretty strong here. We had in the summer a summit amongst allies where we all agreed to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. I think, President Putin has always wanted sort of NATO to go away. I think by him invading Ukraine and antagonizing European allies, if he actually has sort of created a much stronger NATO. And that's why we're at agreeing to 5% of GDP for defense spending. And I think the events over the past weeks will only strengthen European resolve to build the capabilities, get the capabilities to counter drones, and to increase their defense capabilities. So I think from an alliance perspective, this is a moment where allies are stepping up and will continue to do so to ensure their security going forward.
Perhaps if I could add, Mr. Chair, the question of resolve is absolutely an important one. I would say that resolve is also backed up, though, by concrete commitments that NATO is making to the eastern flank to provide that deterrent effect, including what Canada has done with our forces in Latvia.
I would also note that the SACEUR has made it very clear that he has the existing capabilities, but we also are aware that it does require additional investment. There's also a bit of a challenge, and for example, we've invested fairly significantly in surface-to-air anti-missile technologies and capabilities for our forces in Latvia. But that's a very expensive response. Using $200,000 missile to knock down, sorry, a $200,000 missile to knock down a $5,000 drone. We're also seeing in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, drones now having expanded capability with 3,000-kilometer ranges, significant additional payloads. In his speech to the UNGAS yesterday, President Zelensky indicated their willingness to share their learning and their technologies with other NATO countries, and he frankly offered an invitation to those of us who want to work closely with them. I think Canada was a very early adopter into that relationship, and if you could provide any update or even just an indication of our willingness to engage in such activity.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. You're absolutely right. The Ukrainians are at the cutting edge of drone technology and counter-drone technology, specifically because of the challenges you identified about using multi-million-dollar platforms to knock down cheap, mass-producible drones. One of the things that is quite exciting is the Build with Ukraine program that Ukraine announced recently. Canada is working with Ukraine and we signed a letter of intent over the summer to potentially do joint ventures with Ukraine, which would provide the ability to manufacture Ukrainian drones here in Canada, benefiting, we hope, the Canadian industry as well as eventually the CAF.
The last point I wanted to ask, and it's tangentially related to the drone incursions over Poland quite recently, but in June of this year, many of our very close allies in NATO, and including Ukraine, withdrew from the Ottawa Convention with respect to landmine prevention. All the Baltic states, Finland and Poland, as well as Ukraine, have now withdrawn from that convention. It does, in my opinion, place our deployment in NATO, particularly in Latvia, as one of the countries that has withdrawn, in a somewhat challenging relationship. And so I think, how would you see Canada navigating that? It's not a contradiction, but it can be a challenge for us, navigating that going forward. And because there are other conventions or values that we've put forward that could be challenged in how our neighbors and friends in NATO, and particularly on the eastern flank with Russia, may have to respond to that.
Brief response, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, indeed. The threat posed by Russia has compelled a few allies to take extraordinary measures to counter Russia, including withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention, which we regret. But we remain very much wanting to work with them and ensure their security and their safety and the safety of our personnel. And so there is CAF measures in place, as I understand, to be able to continue to work with our allies, those who have left the Ottawa Convention and those that are in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we have Monsieur Lemire. Vous avez 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to come back to the topic that my colleague Anita Vandermill asked about on the summoning of the Russian ambassador by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It seems that Mr. Stefanov was reprimanded. Can your department tell us what was reproached more specifically in the context? Thank you for the question. Yes. The day after the incursions, the department asked the Russian ambassador to present himself at the department. We have a policy of engagement with Russia that's very limited. So the fact that he was convened was already a sign that we wanted to talk about something very serious. Otherwise, we don't have any exchanges with him. So during these discussions, as I said, it was to emphasize that the Russian behavior was unacceptable and that if that continued, there would possibly be more serious repercussions. So what were some kind of sanctions or constraints to be imposed on Russia discussed? What was the reaction of the Russian ambassador? Just to clarify, the Russian ambassador, when he was summoned to the department, it wasn't to speak with the minister, it was with high-level officials of the department, because, as I said, we have a policy of limited engagement with Russia, so we limit the engagements. But here we had a high upper level official of a department who was there to explain the fact that we were very unhappy. But there was no mention of sanctions or constraints. In that discussion, there was simply the affirmation that there might be action that might follow. The Russians are very aware of our sanctions. We have more than 3,000 people who are the object of sanctions, and they know about our commitment with the G7 to work on sanctions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to focus a bit on what our deterrence posture is, our deterrence posture, NORAD's, NATO's. You know, in the last month, we've had NATO members shoot down Russian drones that have violated NATO members' airspace. Clearly, there's a deterrence posture there. The drones come in, they're going to be shot down. But then, at the same time, NATO members did not shoot down 3 MiG fighter jets that entered Estonian airspace for 12 minutes. So that's a different deterrence posture than the one on drones. Yesterday, 4 Russian military planes entered the airspace defense identification zone, and were, Canadian and American fighter jets were scrambled. I believe 4 jets were scrambled to intercept and track these 4 military planes. Now, I acknowledge that these Russian planes were in international airspace, that they were operating in a predictable, regular fashion, and that NORAD assessed that there was no threat. But my question is, what would NORAD do if those jets had crossed over from the ADIZ into either American or Canadian sovereign airspace? Would we allow them to fly for 12 minutes into our airspace, or would we shoot them down?
For the question, Mr. Chair, I think we retain the sovereign capability with our allies to respond to aggression in our airspace, which could include shooting down a drone or a plane.
Yeah, but I guess, it's not clear to me what our position is. And so I guess my comment is that if I don't know what our deterrence posture is with respect to Russian jets violating sovereign NATO airspace, not the ADIZ zone, but our airspace, then the Russians aren't quite sure what our position is either, our posture is either. And so, is there any discussion between Canada and other NATO members to clarify what our position is on Russian jets violating NATO members' airspace? It's being reported that, for example, just, I guess, in the last day or so, British, French, and German envoys have told Moscow that they will shoot down the jets if they violate airspace in the future. Yet others, other members are not clear on what they would do. Poland has been pretty clear on it. So, what is our position? Is this an ongoing discussion between NATO capitals and at NATO headquarters in Brussels, or we're just going to muddle along until the next situation pops up? Where are we going with this?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. Mr. Chair, for the question. I think, again, there's always a need to look at the particular circumstances. In the case of Estonia, it's a very crowded airspace in the Gulf of Finland that has Estonia and Finland on the other side, and Russia transiting through from kind of mainland Russia, if we can say, to Kaliningrad. And there's parts of it that are international airspace and parts of it that are airspace over Estonia. The Russians in the past have often gone through or mistaken through, either deliberate or not. And so a judgment call needs to be done by, the commanders who are, controlling the airspace and the pilots, again, in terms of what it is that is going to happen at that time, and again, where where those aircraft are, what they're doing, what is the danger to civilian population, et cetera, et cetera.
Can I just speculate on something? I speculate that if those jets off in the Alaskan ADIZ had entered into American airspace, that they would have been shot down by the U.S. Air Force. And that's precisely why they remained in international airspace. And the corollary of that is taking place in Eastern Europe, where Russia feels that it doesn't have the same deterrence, where Russia feels that NATO doesn't have the same deterrence posture, and we end up with situations like happened in Estonian airspace recently.
Mr. President, Mr. Chair, if I can just respond, I think there is one slight difference I would posit. Again, whether it's in the ADIZ or the KDIZ, we're talking airspace that is very big and large, and there's lots of time to identify these aircraft coming in. There's the ability to intercept them well outside of our airspace. And if we wanted to, or as in the case that happens frequently, there is a communications, there's contact, there's a request for them to move out. If they continue, then I suspect, you're probably speculating right, there would be some action happening. In European airspace, some of it is very tight, and you don't have that lead time to sort of give. So again, commanders would have made the decision they did over Estonia. I think there was probably a desire not to shoot down at this instance, given what had happened a few days before, and not wanting to escalate the situation more. But I do think there may be instances in the future that if that continues, the threshold for Allied response has gone more prepared to go that way.
Thank you very much. We now turn to MP Oliphant.
Chair, and thanks. Yeah, I'll follow up a little bit on Mr. Chong's comments. I won't speculate about what the United States would do at any moment these days. However, I'd like to know a little bit more about the American response to these drone incursions in the airspace, and also France and Germany and the UK. If there have been any sort of bilateral responses from those four partners, in addition to what NATO has done through the General Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. President. Maybe I can start, and I invite Mr. Curran to add. I'm not going to talk about anything in the classified space, but we have seen signaling, certainly on the part of the U.S., including from President Trump, on sort of any further incursions. He said under certain circumstances, he wouldn't have an issue with having allies shoot down a Russian aircraft. I'll stop there.
I can just add, Mr. Chair, that we have seen allies, including some of the countries that you listed, provide fighter jets and support to Eastern Sentry, which reinforces deterrence on the eastern flank.
Tell me more about Eastern Sentry again, and what that would entail, what Canada's response could be to that, and what asks Canada could receive on it. I know that takes some speculation, but do your best.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I apologize. Eastern Sentry is a NATO mission designed to reinforce NATO response and awareness on the eastern flank. So it includes, for example, fighter jets, radar capability to identify, as well as the support that is around that. In addition, as a mission, it includes headquarters capability, exploitation, that sort of thing. In terms of Canada's contribution to that, as I mentioned previously, Canada has not so far provided additional capability to Eastern Sentry, although we do continue to look at that. But I would just highlight that our support to overall deterrence on the eastern flank is quite high, given the forces that we deploy to Latvia, and we continue to maintain a deterrent posture here in Canada and North America as part of NORAD.
Well, and proudly so. I want to shift. Most of our attention on this tends to go to the Baltic, and we tend to look at that body of water. I want to just move us a little bit to the Black Sea, and wondering what we are seeing responding to. I mean, that's Romania, Bulgaria. There is activity in the Black Sea, and there's mining operations. There's a number of things going on with respect to the Black Sea. Could you just give us a little intelligence or a thought, a small I intelligence about what Russia's activities are on that side of the continent?
Maybe I can start, Mr. President. Obviously, we've seen, again, drone airspace violations there over Romania. So certainly there's, by the Danube there's an area where drones will often overfly there to go and strike into Ukraine. In the Black Sea itself, I would, yes, there's activity, but I would posit that throughout the course of the war, Ukraine has done, frankly, a very amazing job at neutralizing the Russian Black Sea fleet, moving it out of Sevastopol and further west into production with for protection out of harm's way for maritime UAVs, but also ground-based missile attacks, as we saw when it sank the Moskva. We've also seen open source reporting, seen again maritime-based drones hitting maritime oil ports or offloading sites. So it is very much an active theater.
And just in closing, maybe a comment would be to say that I think Mr. Putin has been probably caught off guard that NATO is stronger than it was before, as opposed to weaker. Sweden and Finland joining has added capacity, and I've often said to both countries, we've gained more from them joining NATO than they have gained in some senses because of their huge military capacity. I would also say we have things to learn from Ukraine, that we have done training in Ukraine, but from that training, they have continued to add capacity that I think NATO will need in the future. So I hope our government will keep that door open to learn from Ukraine.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we'll go to the next Member of Parliament, Madame Rood.
Thank you very much.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. How have Russian officials responded to the concerns Canadian officials have raised in relation to airspace violations and other destabilizing tactics?
As I mentioned earlier during the conversations with the ambassador of Russia, there was kind of a number of reasons or excuses. One, it didn't happen. Two, not Russia's fault. These things might have been jammed. It was accidental. And we've seen that even in a lot of public discourse on the part of Russian officials denying intent for these actions.
Thank you very much. What is the Government of Canada's assessment of Russia's use of destabilizing tactics, including sabotage, as well as malicious electronic and cyber activities? And yeah, if you could answer that one first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we mentioned earlier, Russia is indeed engaged in all of these fronts versus allies, versus Canada, but certainly in the cyber realm. And then in the disinformation realm, though there are some other actors that are probably more active in Canada than that. So it is something that we are actively watching and actively working with our allies and partners to counter where we can.
Have we seen an increase in the use of propaganda and disinformation in Russian language mediums, both in Canada and abroad? And if so, what strategies are being employed to mitigate this? And is it happening, in official language media?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I don't have that information. That is not sort of my area of expertise. I can say that as part of within Global Affairs Canada, there's a section that's called the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism that has been launched by Canada as part of the G7 entity that has the G7 countries as well as NATO and EU organizations involved that sort of monitors disinformation and seeks to redress that and also looks at election monitoring issues. But I'm not familiar to the detail of its work, but there is an active element of the department that looks at that.
Thank you very much. What specific threshold, duration, altitude, payload, or proximity to critical sites would Allied air forces be authorized to engage in without further political clearance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have that information, unless you do.
No, I don't.
Is that something that could be provided if it's not classified?
Certainly, if the answer is not classified, we could provide.
Thank you. I'm going to cede the rest of my time to MP Cramp-Nyman.
Okay, a couple of high-level questions. Are there any lessons that Canada could draw from with regards to these incidences for protecting our own critical infrastructure against drone incursions?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So, absolutely. I think both in this situation and from what we've seen in the general war in Ukraine, we've seen that there's a strong likelihood that this will be a major part of future conflict. In addition, as we've seen in Denmark, there are risks there outside of a conflict area. So I think it speaks to the ability to be able to respond from a counter UAV point of view, both from a direct, kinetic way, from a strike point of view, but also in terms of jamming, counter drone UAVs, that sort of thing, and radars that can detect threats of this nature.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, in the nature of time, I believe, is what message does it send to both allies and adversaries if violations of sovereign airspace are tolerated without meaningful consequences?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I would say in this instance, there has been consequences. The first instance is, at least in the case of the Polish airspace, a number of drones were shot down. Secondly, you had NATO allies invoke Article 4 twice in the span of a week, having then a NAC, North Atlantic Council statement, which means that it is agreed and by all 32 members, that is very strong in condemning Russian behavior and actions, and then setting up a new operation or a mission in Eastern Sentry. And yes, some of that will take a bit of time to ramp up, but that does signal, frankly, a fairly robust and rapid response on the part of NATO.
Thank you. And perhaps just one last question is how long does it take to detect and intercept drones that are crossing into Allied airspace?
Brief response, please.
I don't have the technical knowledge for that.
Neither do I. Maybe just to say that, thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe just to add that we maintain that the allies maintain the capability.
Thank you.
To respond.
Thank you very much. We'll next move to MP Van den Belt. Bill is after.
Okay. No, thank you. I'm very pleased that I could get another round. Thank you very much. And I'd just like to follow a little bit about what your answers were before about the fact that Russia is not claiming these operations, and particularly when you're looking at the ones that we're not certain of, like the airports. Why would they be targeting something like the Copenhagen airport? What is the sort of strategic interest? What message would they be sending? And then what would be the purpose in then denying that it was them?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Again, speculating, I don't know motive, but you could easily see that doing so is intended to disrupt, cause disruption, fear amongst the population, and by denying it, it also then sort of obfuscates sort of who is it, and sort of just simply adds more questions. So this is part of the Russian narrative in a hybrid context where it's below clear thresholds of conflict, and it's activities that are simply intended to distract, sow fear, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe my colleague has a few other suggestions, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just an observation that various experts have made, that this is part of, I don't know, the so-called hybrid type of measures that Russia has a large toolkit to use, and in the context of these measures, they have done things that can inflict psychological pressure on populations and governments. It's part of the destabilization efforts that take many forms, but this overflying airports, for example, is disruptive, but also destabilizes the government's response and understanding of what's going on. Thank you.
The fact that that they are not that they are trying to leave some doubt as to the origin of these incursions, does this then make it more difficult to do retaliatory or responsive measures, given that, or does it actually? Is it the opposite? Is it if they did claim it, it would actually require greater retaliatory measures because it would be a much more aggressive act if it was not denied?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Certainly, the latter point, if they openly declared that this was theirs, then the it kind of forces a much more rapid response. Whereas denying it leaves it sort of out there, and it allows them again to see how a government or the alliance responds to these challenges.
Earlier in your, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, maybe just if I could just add, Mr. Chair, regardless of whether these incidents are claimed, I think there's a clear understanding that there's escalatory activity that is happening here, hence why these deterrent responses are being augmented.
And I would also add, if I may, I mean, certainly the Danish authorities and the Norwegian authorities and allied authorities, when these things happen, they will do the investigation, follow through, and eventually, come to a more solid conclusion as to what has happened.
And just going back to something you said in the very beginning, that there were a number of European countries that responded, and I can't remember which incursion that was. You mentioned the Netherlands and Italy and other. How is that coordinated, and how quickly can these nations come together and actually do a response in real time?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So as part of NATO response, we also have what's called air policing missions. Mm-hmm. So there are allies. Canada has contributed in the past. So in the case of Poland, there were, I believe, Italian fighter jets that participated, as well as from the Netherlands, who were conducting air policing missions. And so that's part of our overall response.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to say the exact same thing. There's Baltic air policing, but NATO also conducts air policing in other areas along the eastern flank, the Adriatic and Western Balkans, Iceland and Benelux, where allies take a tour, 4-month tour or so, and deploy to different bases, and are then responsible for airspace coverage in those countries.
And you said Canada participates in this, so had it been Canadians that were policing that particular area, would it be conceivable that it would have been Canadians that would have intercepted?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We have previously participated in air policing missions in Romania, Latvia, and Iceland. Mm-hmm. We weren't participating in this particular moment, but yes, had it been us, we could have been the response.
Okay.
Thank you. Next, we have MP Lemire, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais...
Thank you, Chair. I would like to hear you speak about our capacity, our drone capacity. Have we built drones that can fly for long times in northern conditions, such as in the Arctic and in the Canadian North? There are drones that are capable. There are Canadian industries that produce such drones. So flying a long time, and they can help us with our logistics. For example, RQ-8, which has a great capacity. And if maybe my colleague had some points to add. Thank you. I was just wanted to say that the Canadian forces already have a contract signed for RQ-8's long-range drones. They're American drones that are specifically made to help Arctic surveillance. Are these drones armed? I don't know that. The Canadian Armed Forces said in 2022 that there are problems in terms of ice and satellite coverage in those areas for drones. Have we improved our satellite capacity and the capacity of those drones to do surveillance in winter conditions in terms of the batteries? That's an issue. Yes, thank you. Chair, I'm not aware about satellite coverage issues. I know that the American forces, in addition to the RQ-8 drones, are building Sea Patrol P-8 planes that can do surveillance in the Arctic area. So you said these are America drones. Was anything done to see whether Canadian technology could be made and these drones could be built in Canada? So we don't want to give them our data necessarily. And in the current diplomatic context with the U.S., could that cause problems? Response, I'm not able to tell you whether there were attempts to reach Canadian companies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go back to this talk about the NATO response and our deterrence. You know, in recent weeks, the sheer volume of Russian threats has been head-spinning. It's hard to keep track. You know, we've had the drones over Polish and Romanian airspace. We've had Russian MiG fighter jets violate Estonian airspace. We've had a Russian aircraft buzzing a German naval vessel in the Baltic Sea. We've had purportedly Russian drones over airports in Oslo and Copenhagen, and just recently, in recent hours, reported over other airports as well in the region. And that comes on the heels of, as Mr. Oliphant has mentioned, the severing of communications cables in the Baltic Sea for the Baltic states and for Finland. Norway recently said that Russian hackers broke into the controls for a Norwegian dam, opening up the sluices for 4 hours before they could get control of it. And they're messing around with foreign interference here in North America and in European states. And you know, when I look at NATO's response, frankly, it seems less than coherent and comprehensive. You know, I don't understand what our deterrence posture is with these repeated incursions into NATO airspace. And I'm not alone. Like, I just looked at some of the headlines today. CBC headline is, Putin is poking NATO with drones and jets. The military alliance is still sorting out its response, end quote. CNN's headline today is, NATO divided on how to respond to repeated Russian incursions. We are a senior member of the NATO alliance, one of the founding members. You know, what are we doing to sort out our position on these incursions and reestablishing the posture of deterrence?
Mr. Chair, for the question. As we've highlighted previously, you know, again, these incursions, I agree, are egregious, reckless, and that is how the 32 allies have qualified them publicly. They've signaled that through 2 Article 4 consultations, a North Atlantic Council statement, and are in the process of establishing a number of new measures called Eastern Sentry. As I mentioned earlier, I think, you know, we've seen in the past a number of incidents involving critical underwater infrastructure. The alliance did set up Baltic Sentry, and we've seen a drop from that. So again, I think we're still in the early days in the response, and you know, to ensure that SACEUR has already said he has the tools and authorities he needs. He just needs some more assets, and allies are providing those. The difficulty or the challenges is that NATO as an organization is frankly very much heavy on the conventional side. It does do work on cyber, it does do work on hybrid, but then some of the response options in some of those domains are not within NATO's remit.
But off the top of my head, from my recollection, a NATO member did shoot down a Russian fighter jet that violated NATO airspace about a decade ago. And the Russians accepted that. They were upset, obviously, but they tacitly acknowledged that they had violated that NATO member's airspace. So again, there doesn't seem to be a consistent response across the alliance to these violations of our airspace. And it's hard to establish deterrence when it's not clear what the posture is.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Fully aware of the Turkish shoot down of a Russian aircraft in the past. I think the context is different at the moment. There's a hot war going on in Europe, in Ukraine. The commanders and the alliance will determine in due course what it needs to do, if and when it needs to do. I think having the Estonian airspace violation, for example, having occurred simply a few days after initial Article 4 consultation, could probably have been seen as very escalatory, and so the authorities decided not to shoot it down. I don't know. I'm speculating, and I shouldn't be speculating, but I'm speculating. But looking forward, the Allies have since come out very strongly in sort of reaffirming collective defense and reaffirming their desire to ensure Allied defense and territorial defense.
Thank you very much. We next turn to MP Bill Blair.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. If I may follow up just briefly on Mr. Chung's comments. I am aware that the NATO response will be determined by NATO Command and by the SACEUR, based on our capabilities. And I'm pretty confident personally that conversation is taking place right now. And I know that I would expect and I anticipate there might be a reluctance to start making, even though the media is very anxious for it, a declaration of red lines for NATO. And I think it'll be a thoughtful and nuanced response. But I have great confidence in that command and the SACEUR to respond. I think it is important that we be patient and let them work out because clearly the Russians are probing. There is something else, though, that has changed fairly significantly in the past 2 weeks. We've seen from the United States and from the President of the United States, first of all, a declaration that he was considering imposing tariffs upon those countries that were purchasing Russian energy. That has a very significant impact on their capacity to continue to build up their military. And the threat of those tariffs can also have some implications for Canada. We're working also with other trade relationships with some of those very countries. And I think that if you have any kind of assessment on what that impact of that might be, it would be interesting to us. And secondly, at his speech at UNGAS, the President of the United States also indicated just this week a very significant change in their initial posture in that he now declared that he supports the restoration of Ukraine's original territorial integrity and in the restoration of all of the territories that have been seized and occupied by Russia. That's a very significant change. And I think it is something for NATO to contemplate. And I wondered if Canada, if our Foreign Affairs Minister and our government has determined what would be the appropriate response to that change in posture, which is being articulated by the President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. You are correct in highlighting that the President of the United States has gone out publicly with a very significant change. We are certainly have been and will continue to work very closely with the U.S. In terms of actually trying to arrive at a peaceful solution in Ukraine. And sort of have been working with them very closely on that, although we have seen the response from Russia, even following President Putin's meeting with President Trump in Alaska, has been met with escalation. So the Russians clearly are not seemingly ready to engage in a meaningful conversation. So there is certainly a conversation amongst allies, amongst the G7, into how we can increase pressure on Russia, whether it's through sanctions, recognizing, and sanctions have been in place, taken in coordination with their partners. I mean, they are having an impact on the Russian economy. It is starting to show some strains. Inflation is high. It's difficult for it to purchase and has to rely on sort of other partners for a number of items. We recognize that oil and gas continues to be an important source of revenue for the Russian economy, and and that is why we are looking at other options under our G7 presidency to reduce Russia's oil revenues. In the long term, we know that this is, the sanctions are causing persistent diversion of resources for Russia, so it is damaging its growth potential.
Perhaps, Mr. Chair, if I could just add, when we look at the basket of options for response in these situations, our support for Ukraine is part of that equation, and we certainly welcome any partners who are increasing that support. And I do think the military assistance that Canada has provided is part of the response that we are able to provide in these situations.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I appreciate it's been a fairly significant change in posture from the United States, and it will take some time. The last thing I wanted to ask, and the NATO has long declared that it will defend every square foot of NATO territory. But in that defense, I think there has to be an acknowledgement that, for example, if a jet flew over Estonia for some period of time, NATO's ability to respond to that, because the jets are not all stationed at the Estonian border, but rather are stationed, the NATO response jets would be stationed further back from that border. And it would take actual time to detect the threat and then to respond. And if the Russians only came in for 12 minutes and then turned around and fled, it may not necessarily do that. But there are a number of ways in which I think it has been declared on how we will respond. So that capability, I think it would be very helpful if you were able to provide us with some insight as to how long it would take to respond. And by the way, I think this is somewhat related to the withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention, because our NATO allies, particularly on that eastern border with Russia, have become very concerned about slowing down any potential incursion. And so the time of response, I think, is relevant. And perhaps you could provide us with some insight on what the limitations of that might be.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Certainly NATO response times would be classified. That is part of the information potentially that the Russians are seeking to determine. But I guess the unclass answer in this space would be that NATO maintains a response capability, or a robust capability to respond. The question of two previous questions today about how that response should happen, I think, is something that is maintained by commanders, but that ability to respond remains and is being augmented in response to these incursions.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to the conclusion of the fourth round of questioning. If members have additional questions, here's the opportunity to do so. Monsieur le Maire, one or two questions. Thank you.
Merci. Première
Thank
question,
you.
est-ce que
So first question, do you know what Russia's capacity is in terms of drones, especially in a winter context? Are they further advanced than we are? Do they have the same thing for their fighter jets working in northern contexts? You said that they developed that technology before. Yes, it's for certain that Russia increased their drone capacity during the Ukraine war. That's why we're working with the Ukrainians to take note of the lessons of their experience in Ukraine so that we can increase our response capacity for the Canadian forces. But we are also encouraging the industry to work with factories, with the producers, the Ukrainian producers, so they can strengthen their capacity. On the northern aspects, yes, it's winter in Ukraine, but it's maybe not as cold as it is here. So in terms of winter, we're working with our allies in the Arctic as well. It's an opportunity for the industry in Canada, but also for the allied countries' industries. It's not just a question of climate, it's also a question of counter-electronic measures. For the fighter jets, and we're trying to learn all of these lessons so we can strengthen our capacity. Second question. So in the media, in Europe, in the U.S., do you know how it's described in Russia. Are these incursions mentioned in Russian media, or is it not mentioned, or is there some kind of Russian propaganda related to these recent incursions? Thank you, Chair. Maybe I can start, and my colleagues can also answer. In the Russian context, the Russian war is not a war; it's a special military mission, and not many media report on the developments there. In terms of the incidents we're discussing, that have happened over the past few weeks, I have to say that I don't know what's being said in the Russian press at this point. I don't know, Stefan, if you have seen anything. But I wouldn't be surprised that it's not mentioned much.
Officials for your testimony and for appearing for this study. That concludes this meeting. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Thank you. Meeting adjourned.